שוב שלום. כעת נתחיל במושב השלישי שיעסוק בהתמודדות עם הקורונה, אסטרטגיות ליום שאחרי. יושבת ראש המושב היא סוזי פאט בנבניסטי, מנכ"לית מרכז טאוב. בעבר סוזי הייתה מנהלת מדיניות ציבורית באתנה, חברה מובילה לביטוח בריאות בארצות הברית, עבדה בארגונים ללא כוונת רווח בתחומי תכנון ופיתוח משאבים, וסיפקה ייעוץ בנושאי ניהול, אסטרטגיה ופעילויות למגוון לקוחות בארצות הברית, בישראל וברואנדה.
אוקיי, תודה רבה ליאורה. אנחנו בכל המושבים עד עכשיו, אז קצת גלשנו בזמן. אמרתי לאבי עכשיו שאני צריכה בערך ב3:30 לצאת מפה להוציא את הילדה שלי ממסגרת לגיל הרך, לפני שהקייטנה תיגמר בשעה 4, אז יש לנו סטופ ציני. hard stop בדיוק. אז בשלב הזה של היום בתחילת המושב השלישי אנחנו כבר בוודאי מבינים את החשיבות הגדולה של הגיל הרך בהתפתחות מיטבית, את הפלסטיות של המוח, ויש כמובן הזדמנויות משמעותיות בגילאים האלה לבנות בסיס להישגים לטווח ארוך. אבל מה קורה כשההזדמנויות החינוכיות נקטעות, כשילדים צריכים להישען רק על מה שהם מקבלים בבית, וכשגם ההורים הכי משקיעים ואכפתיים הם חסרי אונים מרוב מתח, כך שהם לא יכולים להשקיע כמו שהיו רוצים בהתפתחות ילדיהם, או שאין להם את הכלים לעשות כך או את הזמן. מהם האתגרים שנוצרים, מהם הפערים שנוצרים, מהן ההזדמנויות שנוצרות, ואיך אפשר להתמודד עם האתגרים ולנצל את ההזדמנויות. אילו התאמות עלינו לעשות בשנים הבאות, על מנת לעזור לילדים שהחמיצו את ההזדמנות לחוות תהליכים התפתחותיים סטנדרטיים בשנה וחצי האחרונות. היום מצטרפים אלינו מומחים שפועלים בתחומים אלו במסגרת משרד החינוך, באקדמיה ובמרכז טאוב, ושיוכלו לשפוך אור על האתגרים והפערים שנצפו, על הדרכים להתמודדות איתם, על ההזדמנויות שעלו ועל הדרכים הכי טובות לנצל אותם. אציג עכשיו את שלושת הדוברים שלנו, ואז ניגש ישר לעניינים. אני שמחה להזמין את פרופסור יאיר זיו, ראש החוג לייעוץ והתפתחות האדם וראש התוכנית הרב-תחומית לחינוך והתפתחות בגיל הרך באוניברסיטת חיפה. במחקרו הוא עוסק בהתפתחות הרגשית והחברתית של ילדים בגיל הרך. לאחרונה שימש יו"ר המועצה לגיל הרך במשרד החינוך, בנוסף עמד בראש צוות המומחים של משרד החינוך בנושא פערים ותהליכי אי שוויון בגיל הרך בתקופת הקורונה. אחרי פרופסור זיו תדבר דוקטור מרב תורג'מן, מנהלת היחידה להפעלה פדגוגית, האגף לחינוך קדם יסודי במשרד החינוך. היחידה עוסקת בפיתוח והטמעת חומרי הוראה בתחומי הליבה עבור כלל הגננות ובפיתוח הגן העתידי כתפיסה חינוכית המותאמת למאה ה-21. בעבר ניהלה גן ילדים במשך 17 שנה. לבסוף תדבר דוקטור קרמל בלנק, חוקרת בכירה ביוזמת מרכז טאוב לחקר ההתפתחות ואי השוויון בגיל הרך, וחברת סגל במחלקה למדעי התנהגות במרכז האקדמי רופין. תחום המחקר המרכזי שלה הוא אי שוויון בחינוך, וכן היא חוקרת פערים מגדריים בלמידה במקצועות המדעיים וההייטק, STEM לבגרות, וכן את האופן שבו קבוצות חזקות מנצלות טוב יותר מסלולים של הזדמנות שנייה לרכישת השכלה גבוהה. אז עכשיו אני אזמין אותך, פרופסור יאיר זיו.
אוקיי, תודה רבה. אז אנחנו מקבלים את שעת אחר הצהריים המנומנמת, ואחרי סשן שהיה קצת סוער, סשן שלנו, יש לו פוטנציאל להיות סוער, אבל אני מניח שהזמנים ישפיעו עליו גם כן. אז כמו שסוזי אמרה, אני פסיכולוג התפתחותי, פרופסור להתפתחות הילד שעוסק במחקר בגיל הרך באוניברסיטת חיפה. ואני פה באיזשהו תפקיד שאני מרגיש שאני מייצג איזושהי ועדה שעמדתי בראשה, ועדה של מומחים שהקדישו הרבה זמן בחודשים האחרונים לייצר את המסמך הזה, שאולי אתם יכולים לראות אותו בצורה חלקית, שנקרא פערים ותהליכי אי שוויון בגיל הרך בעקבות תקופת הקורונה. זו הייתה קבוצה של 20 מומחים, גם אנשי, קודם שאלו, כן, עוד פעם נחזור לעניין, מי יושב מסביב לשולחן, אז פה ישבו כולם, נשות שטח ונשות ואנשי רשויות מקומיות ואנשים מהאגף לחינוך קדם יסודי ואנשי אקדמיה, הרבה מאוד אנשים ישבו ביחד והקימו וכתבו את המסמך הזה. מי שכסתה את רוב עבודת הכתיבה היא דוקטור יעל קסנר ברוך ממכללת בית ברל ומכללת לויצקי. אני עזרתי לה ודוקטור עודד סלע, שהיא מנהלת תחום הייעוץ המדעי בלשכת המדען הראשי של משרד החינוך, שנינו עזרנו לה בכתיבה. מה שאני אציג היום מבוסס על המסמך הזה, קיווינו מאוד שהוא יהיה זמין להפצה כבר היום, זה היה נראה לנו מקום טוב להנגיש אותו, אבל במשרד החינוך יש כל מיני תהליכים, והשרה צריכה לאשר, אז היא עוד לא אישרה, אבל אני מניח שזה יהיה בשבוע הבא, המסמך כבר מוכן, אם אתם לא יכולים להתאפק ואתם רוצים אותו, אתם יכולים לשלוח לי מייל, ואני אשמח לשלוח לכם את המסמך. זה לא מסמך שיש טעם להדפיס אותו, כי הוא מסמך מאוד אינטראקטיבי, עם המון הפניות למחקר שנעשה בתחום. אז השאלה המרכזית שאנחנו שאלנו בוועדה הזו היא איך ניתן לזהות ולאפיין תהליכים של פערים ואי שוויון שמתרחשים, שנוצרו כבר ועתידים להמשיך להיווצר ללא התערבות בגילי הגן בתקופת הקורונה, ומה הדרכים הנכונות לפעול כדי למנוע ולגשר על הפערים האלה. והמסמך מחולק לשלושה מרכיבים, וגם המצגת שלי תהיה בנויה באותה צורה על סמך שלושת המרכיבים. אז קודם כל נקודות עיקריות שבבסיס הפערים ואי שוויון בגיל הרך. לא יהיו כאן הפתעות, אני אציג כמה מהנקודות, אנחנו במסמך מציגים הרבה נקודות, אני אציג 3 נקודות מרכזיות שהן מאוד משמעותיות בעינינו. אחרי זה אני אציג אסטרטגיות פעולה, קראנו להם שיש לשקול, אבל הצענו אותם דברים שנראים לנו שהם מבוססי מחקר ונכון לפעול על פיהן, ולא פחות חשוב, אסטרטגיות שמהן מומלץ להימנע. אני חושב שזה אלה הדברים, האסטרטגיות שמהן מומלץ להימנע, צריך לשים לב לדברים שאמרנו שם, כי יש שם דברים שעושים. עושים במשרד החינוך ועושים גם במקומות אחרים, אז כדאי לשים לב גם לדברים האלה. אז אני אתחיל ב3 נקודות עיקריות שאני רוצה להציג, שנמצאות בבסיס הפערים ואי השוויון, ונתחיל כמובן מהתפתחות של ילדים
particularly from the development of children and the understanding that early childhood is a sensitive time particularly, and so particularly developmentally, and there will be significant impact on children at this age, perhaps even more impact than on older children, and that this impact will be longer term without the appropriate intervention. Here you have one example I assume most are familiar with. No, it's Patt, the Perry study, all sorts of methodological problems there, but what we do see is CT scans of a child with normal development. This is the left versus a child that suffered neglect in the 3 first years of his or her life. You see the very clear difference. I'm not even talking about the less clear things, things that have to do with degeneration, but in terms of the volume, mass of the brain, you can see a difference between a brain that is in the 15th percentile versus 2nd or 3rd percentile. of children that have experienced neglect, and we have a lot of other developmental research findings that talk about the developmental and functional problems of children in children that experience neglect and that experience whatever deficit in those critical times of their early childhood development. So that's the first point. The second point tells us that, and this again relates to the first point, that there's a very high chance, and we know this not only from the current crisis. You'll see later on as I present to you a lot of references to all of these findings, because we have a lot of findings already from the current crisis, but these are things that we know from a lot of previous crises, and the history of humankind is littered with such crises. So we can learn from the past as well, not only the immediate past. And what we see that after a crisis, people obviously who are hurt the most are children, and particularly children from poorer backgrounds, weaker backgrounds. And so what we sadly always know that we do see that gaps that existed prior to COVID between the more affluent and less affluent, these gaps will only widen, and this will happen in a wide range of areas. In terms of adapting to a framework, in terms of children that are from weaker populations will experience more difficulties in adapting. It will happen in emotional issues, social issues, issues that have to do with behavioral regression, anger attacks, tension, stress, anxiety, cognitive deficits in terms of learning and language. It will happen in terms of vocabulary. We already have a new study, by the way, that is conducted here in Israel that demonstrates the increased gaps in language. And Elad from the Bank of Israel isn't here anymore, but yes, okay, from the Bank of Israel, they published a study several months back with the findings from the US that show language, very significant and increasing language gaps between weaker and stronger populations in learning skills, administrative skills, management, all of these things. We sadly will see an increase of the gaps, and we will see this in cognition, in understanding things, physical phenomena, and understanding reality, and understanding processes of social processing of information. And we'll see it, we already see it in fact, but we will continue to see significant gaps that have to do with the malnutrition. Someone spoke to me. Physical health. And through all of the emotional things that I mentioned, because I mean, it all interrelates. All of these problems connect and interconnect and impact each other, and we'll see these cross correlations in a very significant way. And the third point that I'd like to emphasize is very significant in terms of intervention. And this point says that the source oftentimes for gaps and their worsening are the parents, and to a significant but lesser degree also the education staff. But those same sources are also the most efficient way to narrow the gaps. So we know that for parents, variables such that relate to their background, to the parental well-being, to the parents' socioeconomic background, to the level of education, all of this indirectly impacts less optimal development of their children, indirectly, because all of these factors influence children through how the parents conduct themselves. So It seems so for the parents and how they their behavior and management, and for the education staff, all these things also are indirect impactful parameters on how they manage the children, how they teach children, the interrelations within kindergartens, and the clarity of regulations as well. All of that we have within the document, and within the document itself you can see references to all of the recent studies on these matters. So I'm going to talk about a few strategies that we believe can be effective, and there won't be many surprises. First of all, in order to prevent and narrow the gaps, we have to assess what we're doing, assess it in terms of research. It has to be long-term and short-term, has to include a range of methodologies and cross sources and references and so forth. We recommended establishing really a database, a multidisciplinary database to support educational research. And I think that Yossi talked about this earlier, that the recommendations are applicable. I believe that this recommendation is very implementable. We saw at the database that the Ministry of Education has a huge database of intervention programs, but there's no information on whether these programs are based on research. Is there empirical data? And so we recommend that there be a multidisciplinary, evidence-based database that supports education policies and procedures in kindergartens. We suggest that this be done. And Valda talked about Digital Israel before. I think this is a very convenient platform. And we know that a lot of academians would be very on education in kindergartens, and we hope that it would happen this year, but maybe next year, and also dealing with the understanding the components of resilience and vulnerability in the area surrounding the child, understanding the risks to the children, understanding the perspective on safety and within the kindergarten staff, and also providing a perspective for change, meaning we have to take into account all of the relevant circles, take into understand all of the impact, and look at them and consider them when we talk about change and closing gaps. And let me conclude with the same strategies from which I believe strategies that we believe are recommended, not only the do's but the don'ts as well. Let me conclude with the same strategies from which I believe strategies that we believe are recommended, not only the do's but the don'ts as well. So I think that the first point is that we shouldn't look at the COVID crisis as a focused, unique crisis, a one-off. This perspective, not only is it wrong, I mean, I told you history is, full of crises. It's also harmful because it harms our ability to typify the gaps that thus created, and that probably will continue to stand and we'll have to deal with as time goes on. I'm going to put these three together because these three talk about the same thing. We have to be very careful from planning universal relief, because I said there are things that we do, and that's oftentimes something that is done. Universal answers don't really look to specificity, to locality. When you give the same intervention program in Rahat, and then in Ofakim, and then in Sakhnin, and then Tel Aviv, and then Ramat HaSharon, in the various cities of Israel, when we don't address all of the circles of impact on children, and we don't look at the great variance. Our mandate was ostensibly in the ages of 3, 4, 5. That was the mandate by the ministry, but that's very different in the age of 3 and 4 and 5. All of these ages, it's not the same, not into the perspective of the children or the services they get. I can give you a lot of examples. that are brain studies that show very clearly that it's not the same. And the point, and finally, something that I'll address very, very quickly, but it is very important. The developmental and education study of the last 100 years shows us, 100 years I say because there are studies that were done in crises in the United States, the economic crisis, the Great Depression, and crises that are not only a risk factor, but that are also processes that have an enormous potential for growth. And during a time of crisis, lots of significant things happened that had never been attempted prior, and now there was no choice, and they were capsule learning, and suddenly people saw that they can learn in all sorts of creative ways in small groups. Suddenly parents saw things that are happening, were exposed to learning processes in kindergarten through Zoom, saw that technology through in some way is not, I mean, it also can be a blessing in some way. There are all sorts of ways in which we can learn from this crisis and take advantage of this time, these 2 years in the learning, in order to turn our situation in 1 year much better than it was, say, 3 years ago. And I think that's a very important point and an optimistic point. So thank you very much. Good afternoon. In the previous session, a lot was said about the quality of activity in the various education frameworks. So I'm very proud to show pictures from our kindergarten that show in the best way, I believe, quality care, what it means. That's based on our belief that is the future kindergarten approach. I have the honor of Sima Haddad working with me. We had the point to ask the question years ago, how should a kindergarten look in this very complex reality of the 21st century? And since then, basically, we're developing this point, and the images that you'll see here are images from kindergartens that do implement that approach. So if you see the kids, I hope I'll be interesting enough that you look at me still. Now, the basic fundamental principle that Yair and probably is well known to many is was what we thought in terms of narrowing the gap. But not only, I very much want us to notice this assumption. I mean, number 2, that talks about the characterization of the gaps and from a socioeconomic parameter, and what we saw in kindergartens, the view, this idea has changed a great deal in everything that relates to the COVID gaps, meaning the gaps were found not only in low socioeconomic or certain socioeconomic views as in cognitive function, but in much broader issues, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. So these are the questions that interested us in everything that relates to the gaps in the kindergarten. And the first question is, are there even gaps? I mean, and by the way, this answer is not completely clear, because the more that we sort of met with parents, there were some who said, no, actually our kids became more advanced, so we can talk about that as well. The second question that interested us is what causes these gaps? How are they manifested? And by the way, this is again as looking as kids in kindergarten, what's happening at home, and what's the correct address in terms of the staff, the parents, and so forth. So these are the things that we, in terms of the division, did in order to get the answers to these questions. The expert committee, that was what Yair talked about earlier, which we were part of as well. And I do want to talk about the focus groups that we conducted. This were led by the Metrics Company in, of course, with the Human Capital Unit in the office, in which we conducted various focus groups of different groups, parents, supervisors, teachers, and these are different populations. I mean, you talked about the difference, but also the sectors, the Arab sector, the Jewish sector, the Haredi sector, and we just asked them these questions with understanding their experience, what they see in their day-to-day work, how do they regard these questions. And from everything that we did, as was said earlier, yes, it's true that you can consult and conduct research, but at the end of the day, within the we want to, in the ministry, create policies and create procedures to implement our recommendations and our understanding. So we wrote a policy statement, but I'm showing you the major points of it right now. Now, in order to sound what is a application in kindergartens of these regulations, let's first of all review the data, because it's not as if somebody from Merav or whatever, somebody in the unit, and sort of presses a button and presto, this is our policy now, this is our program, and now it has to be implemented. It can't work that way. You have to understand the scope of this. How many kindergarten over 17,000, how many kindergarten teachers, how many kindergarten teacher assistants, how many children? A lot. We're talking about instruction, for example, or continued education. How many people are we talking about in terms of staff? Overall, generally speaking, there are 140 inspectors, 140, 256 instructors, and 1,020 senior kindergarten teachers, that they're the ones that are holding in their hands a great deal of the recommendations for the policy. So look at the numbers. Now, what are the expected results from narrowing the gaps and conducting this process? In terms that we divided them into things that we're looking at in terms of the children and then from the staff. In terms of the children, we want to see an improvement and advancement in emotionally, socially, behaviorally, and as Yair talked about, cognitively in regards to themselves, meaning there's no uniform standard, but generally speaking, to find some level, some normal standard for their age group. But first of all, in relation to themselves, because the traditional view of narrowing gaps that looked about at narrowing gaps always in terms, I mean, cognitively or just targeting certain populations. This is not what we saw in COVID. In COVID, a lot of children, I mean, a lot of children that don't have particular socioeconomic difficulty came with gaps. So this is in relation to themselves. That's why I point that out. And yes, in terms of the staff, the education staff that underwent a terrible difficulty during COVID, because, I mean, we want to see that they have resilience, that they undergo training, that they get the tools they need to tackle this task, because they're the ones tackling it. Now, the basic assumptions in terms of the process. Yes, we do believe in the division of the ability of education staff to narrow the gap. But we know that the staff needs support and they need tools. And we saw in COVID how versatile kindergarten teachers were. One day you close the kindergarten, you can't talk to the kids because there's a shutdown. You have to work with Zoom. Yes, no, create some kind of rapport. Their responsibility, their desire, their dedication to do this, I mean, really made us think, yes, kindergarten teachers certainly can. A lot of problem of distrust happens as well. There were also that as well. But overall, and remember that we're talking about over 17,000 kindergarten teachers, amazing work. And so here as well, I return to the point. There's such variance between kindergartens. You can't compare between a kindergarten in a very weakened area to a more affluent area, but we saw there's such variance between the kindergartens, even within the same area, and even variance within each kindergarten itself. Another assumption that again has to do with what we learned from the committee, differential variants as discovered in COVID really require ongoing listening to the children, time with the children. This is not something where you suddenly identify a problem and suddenly have some quick solution. Here, we really need long-term programs that are unique. And again, including parents in early childhood is critical. So any program that we build in a kindergarten, it just has to be in some measure of collaboration with parents, because again, in the focus groups, we were told unequivocally, parents are tired, parents are exhausted, saying, let's be within a program or provide support. They're tired. And so this has to be considered when you build such a program of intervention. What are the management principles? Well, first of all, there are several. There's no basic assumption that this is to one area or not to another area. These things are seen overall. There are gaps everywhere. Second, the work program and work plan has to be more focused. It has to be done. I mean, I'm not going to extend on this because already it's been talked about it. I do want to talk about this third point, about training and support of the education staff. In the Ministry of Education, in a move that's historical, has expanded the consultation hours of inspectors. In the ministry, every inspector got a consultant, a full-time consultant, with the understanding of the enormous importance of providing education, professional consultation for the education staff. This is also true for the children, another historical step taken by the Education Ministry, providing hours which were called incorporation hours. From next year, this support will be provided from an earlier age, from year one. This is enormously important as well in relation to narrowing gaps. And finally, building communication avenues from next year on with all of the area, every district. There will be one person who's responsible for liaison with the parents, and kindergarten teacher will get the tools in order to do so. Now, what are the principles, the pedagogical principles? Well, the first talks about a flexible learning plan. I mean, kindergarten teachers always had autonomy. This is no big thing, but the new thing is the new focus on learning of flexibility on 4 specific aspects of the future kindergarten, 4 core principles. First of all, organization of space, meaning a space that's open, dynamic, allows inclusion of the children, inclusion of an outside area as part of the kindergarten to allow children to be there openly. Management of time is the second thing, meaning flexibility in time management. It is very attentive to child needs, that allows sort of a flow. A third is the learning practices, meaning outside kindergarten care. We want children to be outside also the kindergarten care learning. We have over 100 such kindergartens that are forest kindergarten, beach kindergartens, and so forth. They're in the outside area. And finally, content, meaning from the world of the difficulties, challenges, and things the children raise. Now, we will emphasize greatly personal resilience of the children and the staff, and every kindergarten should have a life skills plan, and the kindergarten teacher will get tools for this. This is also not new. A new renewed focus on smaller groups and interpersonal meetings with the children. This is something that happened with New Horizons, but today we're going to emphasize it more. Assessment for learning. The division just completed a digital observation platform that includes 24 items so that every kindergarten teacher can have a sort of list in order to assess the children in various environments, times, and so forth, and get a sort of quick image of all of the developmental points of the child, and also look at the overall kindergarten as a group and identify things that are unique to every child, and also basic trends in terms of implementation. And here I conclude, in terms of the division staff. Our goal is to develop tools in response to Corona, to develop programs. So in the next 2 to 3 weeks, are going to publish our doctrine of the future kindergarten. It's called Path to the Kindergarten, which includes all of the pedagogical aspects of the kindergarten. As I mentioned earlier, a digital observation tool that will be implemented next year among all teachers that will allow very precision evaluation of children. Now, unlike a learning program, this is something that we did, in math or language, along with researchers, to look at the overall study program and say that if we want to narrow graph, let's say in language, what are the points from the program in which we can highlight in order to narrow language graph. So this in math, and we did this in language. Now, as I'm sure there's a connective point between the division and the kindergarten teachers, and that's the district. The district provides specific address to kindergarten that need help, unique help, and within the kindergartens, we would like to see the following. Anything that happens in the kindergarten will begin with a mapping of needs. First of all, by the kindergarten teacher, in different times, in different arenas. Any work program begins from there. Next, after this assessment of the children and assessment of the gaps existing or no, the program will be built based on that map, focusing on very specific goals of children and their needs. And then that plan is implemented, and then the staff, meaning the leading teacher, the consultant, and the staff and the kindergarten workers and additional support will implement it. And that's not, of course, the end. We also want to see evaluation and assessment of the effectiveness of this plan. Thank you very much.
Okay, I do hope that you can see me from here. I'll start this way, and I do hope to get a microphone that would help me leave this podium here. Okay, what I would like is to try and identify or locate the discussion for the reduction of gaps after COVID and connect it to contents that came up during the day. There were contents that came up in almost every topic that we dealt with, and it's very important to mention them, and perhaps that would actually sum up the day. First of all, I think that what Yair presented, what was done by the committee, was very, very apt in the wider context. The Ministry of Education and the government, and on the governmental level, you have to place the gaps at the top of the agenda. It's not happening right now. The head teachers of schools know exactly what percentage of matriculation scores there are, but we don't know what the social gaps are. I think that the Ministry of Education in particular and all other government agencies should create indicators for gaps, not to wait for the PISA test, time after time, as Yossi said at the beginning, to create measurable indicators, to set measurable objectives for the reduction of gaps with respect to exiting the pandemic, but also after. If I were the Minister of Education, I couldn't sleep well if the percentage of matriculations go up, but only in certain areas. So the fact that it's happening only in the strong places is insufficient. We learn, and we also learned today, that the reduction of gaps starts with early education. So we have to actually put this at the center and measure it properly, and also look at other aspects, Ministry of Health, the baby clinics, developmental gaps, for example. The second point, I think that the state needs, much is being said about children and, toddlers, but there's some sort of a perception that toddlers are mostly the problem of their parents. And if educational systems close down because of the pandemic, parents have to work with the kids, put them aside, work from home. There's no proper solutions. We saw it in Defensive Shield operation as well, even though it was only a week. We have to understand that the responsibility of the children cannot be only the parents, and the Ministry of Education cannot give the solution of a distant learning for kindergarten children and later and assume that parents will be there to help. This is no learning. You have to understand that there's a joint system here. Yair talked about the systemic approach of parents, local government, state, all of whom need to work together. And if there's any problem and the educational systems close down, parents require solutions as well. And here I link with what Lenore said. She said, let's shorten the working hours of the assistants. And I say, hang on a second, but if the teams work less, what will we do with the children? Stop working at 2? Perhaps it's high time that parents, not only mothers, would work reasonable hours to shorten the work week and to adapt the vacations of children to those of parents. This is a part of a systemic understanding that both parents as well as children need the time together at home and need to be actually free. And if there's any disruption or any crisis, the response has to be given not only to the children, to the parents as well. Another point that's important, and if we internalize the fact that we do care for the children, we have to also relate to the well-being of parents. It's not only would stressful parents impact children detrimentally, but parents on their own, need our attention, require solutions, and we have to actually lift the burden off their shoulders, if only for a little bit. So I'll give you an example. Dana studied the subject of parental well-being. If it's important to read a story to the child with intonation, definitely a program has to be given for that. Definitely we cannot impose this on parents, and definitely not on parents who live in weaker populations. So you have top quality frameworks to do that, and we also need to lift off the burden of pressure from parents. And if we understand that children have to be at the center of attention of the state as well, then automatically that would reduce the tension of parents, the pressure off their shoulders. And we need to give them, to empower them. If there are instruction or, that kids, various workbooks that children have to work in, they should be given to parents as well. At the moment, the information is not really available. The supervisor is not very accessible. And when there's a problem, it's hard to approach her. The parents do not know what the standards are and what should happen. And ultimately, the Ministry of Education, definitely if we want to create standards and supervision, they cannot reach all, preschools or kindergartens, but we can. We'll be able to help the teachers advance this subject, not really breathe down their neck. Another point, and I only have 10 points, and I'm nearly midway. So it actually says that we have the National Council for Early Childhood. It integrates the work in those ages, but it lacks the budgets and the teeth. I believe that we should give it the power it needs to do its job. Perhaps it has to be some independent agency that has a budget and an agenda of its own, and not only try to convince the clerks and the offices and the ministries to listen. I think also that the report highlighted two very important points of finding-based policy and a very vast collection of figures. correct me, Yair, if I'm wrong, most of the literature that you based yourself on came from other countries, not from Israel. In Israel, we don't have the data concerning the quality of educational frameworks or the development of children in the baby clinics. We have to invest in a longitudinal, qualitative research to have sufficient number of families and to trace every aspect of their lives and their parents. Only in such a way will we be able to better address crises, to identify fluctuations. You saw how interested Elad's presentation was, because there was a change, a natural change that took place, and it was considered a natural experiment. But you cannot expect these changes to happen and to retrospectively collect the data. We'd be better off if we do this in advance. And another point that I believe is clear to all, and I will repeat anyway, we have to place early childhood in the center of attention, not only understand that it's important, but also to allocate the necessary funds and to allocate them immediately. It's true that we don't have the money. Well, we didn't have any money for COVID, but when it broke out, we found the money. And when we needed the vaccines, we found the money. And it's a good thing that we did find it. At the moment, the system is experiencing a crisis, just like they know how to stop everything and to take the money in order to vaccinate the population. That's what children need now. The supervision law that is about to enter is important and valuable, but on the other hand, it's not a reasonable situation that 20 daycare centers in Rat or in Sderot or 40 babysitters of migrant neighbors would stop working because they cannot meet the standards. And what the Ministry of Education would tell us would be, yes, it's true, we should think about this, etc., etc. And the regulations will come into effect soon. We don't have time to think about what will happen in the future. Perhaps the time has come is to delay their implementation by 1 year, or to do it very gradually until we get the budgets, until those training booklets are published in Arabic. We have a new government and we have such complex regulations that should lead everywhere. We cannot say we'll just take care of it later. Ultimately, the school year would start and kids would have no framework to belong to, and we'll see a major drop in the percentage of women who work in the Arab sector, where we do want to encourage employment, and in the ultra-Orthodox as well. The damage that would be created will be very hard to rectify. So perhaps we need to take one step back and give it another thought. To conclude, I will say, and again, I'll emphasize this point. Yossi said at the beginning that they told him to put the money where his mouth is. And I think that we need to hand it over to Lieberman. Now we're waiting for your money, but it's not actually Lieberman's money, it's our money. It's the money that belongs to our children and grandchildren. There was the social protest over the cottage cheese and the cost of living and long political protests. Now it's our time to voice our opinion very clearly, that when it comes to early childhood, we have to treat them now and treat them properly. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much to all three of you. I have so many questions, and I don't really know where to start from. I'll just start, and then we'll open the floor for the audience. I'll say already now that we will make an effort to make sure that the questions would end with a question mark, not an exclamation mark. And in such a way, we'll be able to hear from the audience as well as the amazing speakers that we have. So, one thing that you did relate to in your report, but I'd be very happy to hear from the two of you, Yair, Merav, and of course, Carmel, if you want to also comment, concerning what we do with children now when they are still young. But in the last year and a half, we also have children who were these ages, but now they go to first grade or even second grade and were impacted by all that happened. And perhaps because of lack of solutions or responses, they were not exposed to the most beneficial and optimal processes that we would have liked them to. What are we going to do about these kids who are no longer toddlers, but definitely were impacted by the pandemic? I'd like to say first that the entire topic of transitions was extremely critical during the COVID, because just think that kids were taken to kindergarten for the adaptation time without parents being able to accompany them. Just think about children going to first grade without knowing the framework, without knowing the parents. So those transitions were extremely complex. And because many children who were in kindergarten age during COVID, and today there are in first grade, a certain process was launched by the elementary school system. They developed a program, by the way, not for COVID, even before, but this program is going to be implemented even more, and it says the following thing. The first third of first grade is a certain copy paste of what happened in kindergarten. Yes, so that would resemble what they've been through in kindergarten. I don't have anything concrete to say. I can only say that we related very seriously to the continuum. We thought that this was very significant. It's always important, regardless of COVID. One of our problems is truly this distinction between different ministries. Problems were made during COVID, but when the law of the free mandatory education was legislated, there were problems in the transitions between the younger ages and the older ones, and obviously that's a topic to relate to. We didn't have any empirical data on it, but we know that there's a higher percentage of children whose parents wanted to stay in kindergarten another year because of the crisis. And I asked Merav if there's any information about this, but anecdotally, that's what they said. So there are different influences. It has to be very concrete. The connection between the different ministries and the different departments in a particular ministry should all be synchronized. I'd like to ask now, all three of you raised so many things that need to be done. And of course, there's no money for everything. Not enough money for everything, and apparently we have to convince the people who have the money to actually spend this money on these fields as well. So if we do need to prioritize of the things most essential for us to do now, what would they be? What are the things that need to happen in those frameworks or at home? What type of collaboration between the educational teams and parents, and how can we make that division of labor, and what do we need to do at this stage in general? I'd like to mention two things that I mentioned earlier. The first issue is the consultant to every supervisor. We saw educational teams who are facing emotional difficulties. The way by which they need to conduct themselves as teachers and to what extent what is happening in their home impacts what they do. And as mothers who care for their own children or are worried about them. So the decision to have a consultant with a full-time job is quite a historic decision. And it has a statement there behind it that educational entities should be contained before they contain the children they work with. That's a preliminary stage, which is very important. And as Yair said, there's a great importance attributed to it when it comes to the ability of those teams to support children and their difficulties that arise. And increasing the hours and the solutions given to children once they are detected in kindergarten. In the past, these were given to 5-year-olds and older, and now they will be given to 3-year-old and young and older. So I believe that everything that has to do with the emotional, social will be at the center. It will be at the very center of the entire continuum from kindergarten to 12th grade. Very intensive work is being done. And it only goes to show how critical all these are. And without progress in them, no progress will ever be made. If we look at the continuum, it's a major change that the ministry is undergoing. I hesitate to use the term prioritization, and quite justly, because earlier there was a major discussion on it. Do we need to have gradual changes or not? But I will mention two things that seem specific and substantial. First of all, we talk about gaps and we provide data from the world that these are truly validated. The second thing we need to do is the mapping and identify first and foremost the type of gaps that exist, to identify them by using tools which are validated, and there are such tools and there are ways of how to do it. And the second point that I truly wanted to be able to do this summer, but it won't be done, that would be to build that, I don't know how to call it, the course or whatever it is, for the preschool teachers who go to the kindergartens after the pandemic, but soon enough they'll start a new year and they're supposed to tackle those gaps that we believe are there. They need to know how to do it. They don't have the tools for it, hence we should give it to them. And this should have been done yesterday. So if you talk about the must, then it's first of all to see if there are gaps, we believe there are, and to identify what these are, and to know how to give the field people the right tools to operate with. I'd like to only add, with your permission, I'll dream away a bit. First of all, I think that we need to relate to the 0 to 3 group, as Yair said yesterday. In this context, I'll say, many people said 0 to 3, and I will try to make it more precise. From birth to 3, there are people coming from different disciplines, but we never talk about babies as 0, only from birth to 3, maybe only in terms of sleep hours. Birth to 3, we should start treating them already now, and I believe already by the Ministry of Education, even if they haven't transitioned to its jurisdiction yet. We need to make sure that educational frameworks would not be shut down, and if at all, we want to have more of them. In Noam and Elad's studies, we saw that even those frameworks that existed dozens of years ago and weren't as good as the ones we have now, still they led to changes in so many aspects of life. So now one of the things that we need to make sure is to accompany the various frameworks that find it difficult after the COVID to help them renovate daycare centers, to make sure that there are as many as possible. And once they open next year, to truly mentor them and help them with all that Merav said. It's very funny that after Corona, we had this major military campaign whose results and impact on children were no less serious emotionally and socially. And we saw the aggressions of children, we saw the fears. So we have to take that into account. And as Yair said, you cannot relate to COVID as some sort of an event that would never come back. The situation in which we need to maintain children and give them the resilience, this is the word now, but I truly believe in it, both to the children and the staff members, so that they can contend with any contingency that might arise. So I'd like to ask one last question, and then we'll open it to the audience. Did you relate to this tension between the time it takes to implement processes and policies and the urgency, the sense of urgency of those children who will go back to school in September? You said that there's a digital evaluation kit, but there are things that Yair, you suggested would only be achieved in the summer, very long queues for therapy and psychological treatment in children with COVID or without. It's definitely something that we need to tackle, their emotional needs. So how do we balance between the two? On the one hand, it takes a long time to implement and assimilate processes. We want to do our work in a way that is based on research, but still there's a sense of urgency because these children would not stay too long in these young ages. I can say that in the past, whenever I planned some sort of a process, there was this scholar that asked, how are you planning to implement this? We talked about changing the perception of kindergarten teachers. He said, no. Children have no time. They don't have time to wait until the kindergarten teachers learned. And I do believe that the children, some of whom are in kindergartens now, they need their teacher and not something that she would be in a few years' time. So there are baskets that are being given inside the kindergarten teachers. The kindergarten teachers are being mentored by outside consultants and who help them to implement programs. The digital tool allows them to see every child exactly in the place they're at. It's not a tool whose learning is very gradual. It's merely 23 questions. It's very precise, and it gives you a very precise view of the needs of every child. So I think I'll open the questions for the floor. I'd be very happy if we could hear from people we haven't heard from yet. Hello. Two questions, if I may, concerning the digital evaluation. Is it translated into Arabic? And the second one concerning all that was said, if this is only recognized kindergartens or the ones that are not recognized by the Ministry of Education as well. The informal recognized has the institution emblem, and every daycare center that has this emblem can enter. When it comes to the translation into Arabic, it's being done as we speak. I do not like the fact that things are translated into Arabic because I'm the head of a department for pedagogical development. I have instructors who work with me that to begin with, every production of every tool is done in Arabic. I want cultural suitability from scratch. So we try not to translate, but to make it suitable right from the beginning. Yes, please. Every kindergarten that has the emblem of the Ministry of Education can enter the app. A short question addressed to Yair. You talked about the mapping and the wish to identify if there are gaps. My question is, do we have an existent mapping already? Can we compare this with anything? Merav spoke about the tool that exists, and there are others that are being used, many research tools. We spoke about the fact that we expect gaps in a vast array of fields. It's not just one tool that needs to be used. There are the tools that are easier to use are acquisition of language. She doesn't have the mic anymore, so I can't hear her. Are you talking about, so you're asking if there's a difference? If we find, do you have a baseline? If there is any, then it's coincidental. If there's a study that is financed by the Ministry of Education in the Bedouin community in the south and the north, so there I would have data from before the COVID pandemic. Carmel talked about this, and Yossi said that we need an Israeli longitudinal study that would give us those measures and data. And so when the next crisis erupts, we will be able to make the comparisons. But now we can only compare with studies that started before the pandemic. We have to see whether, again, only in those studies that started before COVID, we'll be able to see if there's any significant change following this specific time. But in the studies, in the document we publish, you have findings from around the world and also from one in Israel that truly, it's an Israeli longitudinal study that was done by a team from the Safra Center that shows the widening of gaps. I only wanted to mention the fact that kindergarten teachers for many years are evaluating every child in a very orderly way, definitely at the age of 3, 4, and 5, who belong to the Ministry of Education. The problem is that they're not digital, they're not written anymore, nobody's collecting them. So there is a certain database, but at the moment it's not translated into integration of knowledge that can be worked with. If you talk about the project of Digital Israel, and there's an intention to bring in more advanced tools or devices to the kindergarten, perhaps we can create a simple one that the kindergarten teacher would feed it with respect to the child's behavior, just as she does to the parent. First of all, we're not using the word evaluation that much. We're doing mapping of the functional capabilities of children. There's a very specific circular that says we should not give tests unless these are in the framework of some research. So we do have the mapping of their functional capabilities. At the moment, this tool allows the kindergarten teacher to map the garden. When it comes to their rights and privacy, you cannot use that information, not even at the level of an inspector. In other words, an inspector cannot compare between different kindergartens. This is a legal issue, and this is why there's a problem there. But beyond anything, we truly object to tests given to children in kindergarten. So mapping can show us different gaps, and it's always contradictory to the pedagogical and educational approach of the ministry. But this tool that which we developed allows kindergarten teachers to look at her kindergarten. We wanted the option of having a kindergarten with no names. It's being processed right now and handled. I'd like to ask and perhaps connect what Yair said at the end concerning looking at a crisis as an opportunity, and the experience that you've gained in the field because of it, because it is expressed in the program, I believe, even when it comes to the skills of children and the technology, which is so very much at the center. It was very hard to see whether that exists or not. So if you can say a few words. I totally agree with this, and it's not a recommendation to see, but we did see what amazing things took place during the pandemic, the ability of the educational teams to change everything we thought was necessary in order to conduct or manage a kindergarten. Indeed, all those teachers with their initiatives and their capabilities did so much. Wonderful things happened because parents were exposed to the truly devoted work that is being done in kindergartens. So everything has good and bad, and this pandemic had its own share too. When we started working on the future kindergarten, even people who heard the name and immediately thought about the technology were truly against the idea. What happened during the pandemic is that we saw that when we don't work from the kindergarten, it's not that bad. It can be a part of the pedagogy, it can serve pedagogy, and some of the pictures showed that a few kids were highly technological. We couldn't ignore that. And a number of actions were taken on how to bring technology into the garden, to the kindergarten. Traditionally, we saw the technology as a child sitting in front of a computer against a wall, but today it's totally different. The question is, how can technology serve the learning of children, deepening their knowledge and understanding, etc.? So yes, this opened many possibilities. Even the entrepreneurial spirit, that really brought about major change. Or again, as I said, in some groups, they said, we don't know what you're talking about. No gaps were formed in our children. Quite the contrary, they made progress. So everything has to be taken with a grain of salt. But again, just to comment on what you said, it's very clear that certain kids never experienced gaps. And that's exactly the source of gaps, that certain kids have them and others don't. Yes, I totally agree. You're right. Definitely there are kids in families that show resilience and they're from a lower socioeconomic group, but there are not many. We have to notice those gaps that were formed, and quite the contrary, what you're saying strengthens this further. There are families where an opportunity was created that they learn together with their children or anything like that, and most chances are that that actually increased certain gaps. It's good for certain families, but the gaps increase nonetheless. And when we talk about digital gaps, I have to say that my experience as a mother was very reserved when it came to the Zoom classes that kids in kindergarten had. I wouldn't call this teaching or learning, but it's very much up to the teacher, of course. But there are people who don't have internet or electricity to begin with. You know, the more you bring technology in and digital characteristics, they're necessarily not accessible to the Bedouin population, the ultra-Orthodox population, and you need to give some sort of an alternative to that. I believe she relates to the fact that children did not meet each other during the pandemic. Hang on a second. Please use the mic. I'll say something that connects to what you two both said. After the first lockdown, we did not call it distant learning. The teacher were instructed to stay in touch among themselves and between them and the children. That was the instruction. Definitely there was no instruction for distant learning. We learned after the first lockdown that this was not a great idea. We saw that it didn't work, so we too learned following this crisis. And when we talked about the implementation of how to manage time and the space, it all goes in that direction. How children, just think about it, even children who returned from lockdown, the kindergarten teacher could not touch them. They had to maintain the social distance. And just think about this, daycare center whose main essence is touching one another. And all of a sudden, the teacher has to stay distant. This bears major significance. And this is why the emotional and the social skills, when it comes to managing time and the environment, they have to allow children to socialize and to invest in it. And it will be very focused in that direction. We'll just take one last question from the Zoom. Yes, Dr. Merav Turgeman, they say that the tools that are offered to teachers are good, but those teachers have 35 children in the daycare center and very little time to work and evaluate them in small groups or individually. Is there any room to put on the agenda the importance of reducing the number of children in daycare centers? As many studies show, that's extremely important in order to give them more time to be available for the kids. The whole idea of lowering the number of children in daycare centers, in the morning it was mentioned too. The main difficulty of teachers is the number of children, and that was very pronounced in the study. I'm not the address to provide a solution for this. I know that it keeps coming up and it costs a lot of money and it doesn't seem likely to happen in the near future when it comes to 35 children in class. And this is why we focus on the work plan. The teachers are required to prioritize what's more important for the kids. What do they need? What do they need right now? And yes, to give up on other things. They're not required to do everything. The practices of working in a small group or personal meeting, it's not something new. And that's the main tool that we use in the kindergarten. We don't sit with 35 children and learn. Learning is done in smaller groups or in personal meetings. So the whole idea of focusing the work plan, making it more focused, is the only way to carry this out. Okay, our time is up. So I'd like to truly thank all three of you and to you, the audience, for this outstanding discussion. I learned a lot, but one of the important things here, in my view, is that much of what we saw during the pandemic reflects gaps that existed even before. They were simply deepened. And I believe that some of what you suggested and that we heard could be implemented not only now for this coming year or 2 years in order to overcome the gaps, but rather things that when it comes to opportunities, we should take the opportunity and implement things not in the short run, but for the long run. So thank you very much. And I think that Yossi will give the closing remarks. when they say that I have to sum up or to wrap up, they actually say that that's the time to say goodbye. And I would like to thank, but before I thank, I can actually remove my mask now. Before I extend my gratitude, I have to conceptually clarify something. The word gaps keeps arising in this discussion or discourse. I'd like to clarify that the word gap has two separate meanings among people who spoke here and in general. When sociologists say gap, they talk about the difference between people or groups. For example, the ethnic gap or the Arab-Jewish gap or things like that. When say developmental psychologists say gap, they're not unequivocal, but usually they use this concept in order to relate to the difference with respect to a norm. For example, what sociologists would call retardation, but we shouldn't use that word. So we can use the same word, but not mean the same thing. So the teacher in me could not, hold himself, and I had to clarify this point. Now, I'd like to say thank you, first of all, to all those who came despite this horrific journey that the media is taking us on. Many of us didn't know whether they should come or not. It's not simple. Even we were not sure, should we use the green passport or not. If you are still with us in the Zoom call, thank you for still being there. Thank you to the Taub Center headed by Adi Weiss and Susie for walking with us hand in hand, encouraging us, supporting us, and allowing us to pull all of our tricks and to do our job. Thank you to Chedva. Chedva is outside, who is so conducive in running these things. Thank you to Anat Sela. Anat knows how to organize these things, to do the PR. And Racheli, who's helping her. Everything was so well organized. Thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to Laura Schreiber, who's also outside. Thank you to all the speakers and the chairs of the different sessions. And thank you to the early childhood team that is doing the job. And I mentioned them all by name at the beginning of the day. And of course, once again, thank you to the foundations, all three foundations who make it possible for us to do this work. The Bernard van Leer Foundation, the Beracha Foundation, and Yad Hanadiv Foundation. Thank you very much.